Let's go ahead and set your project folder to that folder you just downloaded.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So are we supposed to be doing this while you're doing it?
It would probably be a good idea.
Well, I can't get my second monitor to turn on.
You might have to switch stations.
Okay.
They just installed this thing this weekend, so I expect there will be some glitches here and there. The training we got for it consisted of, there's a thing that will let you broadcast to other monitors, so that's cool. Luckily, there's a button here that has one monitor and then lots of monitors underneath, so it seemed like that was the thing that let me broadcast. All right, whenever you've got your project set, if you look in the scenes directory, you should see there are two scenes. One is called leg UV demo, one is called pumpkin UV demo. I'm going to start with leg. So if you open that file, you'll see something that sort of vaguely resembles a leg. I believe your UV texture window will pop up by default. If it did not, you can get to it by going to Window, UV Texture Editor. All right, it looks like I saved the version where I actually did part of the unwrapping for you, but that's okay. We'll kind of redo that. So far when we've dealt with UVs, we've had a cube, and we used the default UV layout that Maya gave us, and that was fine because it was a cube. Everything that's more complicated than that, you pretty much have to do something to the UVs to get it to work. So here, an example would be this sort of leg shape. Luckily, there are multiple projection tools that we can use to create UVs to basically to identify the relationship between how a texture wraps around this object and the object's topology in 3D space. Yeah. So when you go to Window, UV Texture Editor, probably restart Maya. Thank you. I mean, sometimes windows will pop up behind other windows, but if it's just not anywhere, then it's a display error, I guess. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of ways that we could unwrap this. In our polygons menu set, under Create UVs, we've got some options: planar mapping, cylindrical mapping, spherical mapping, and automatic mapping. There's also Create UVs based on camera, which is just a different interface for getting planar mapping. Let's talk about automatic first, and then cylindrical for this leg, and then we'll use spherical for the pumpkin, and we'll actually use planar for both of these just as an example. So go ahead and just select the leg and click automatic mapping. You'll see some interface stuff show up here. We'll talk about how to adjust that in just a second, but let's see what it actually did. Let's go to Window, UV Texture Editor. So that's the automatic map. That's not terrible. I mean, I can kind of see what parts of the leg are where, right? The goal is to make this human readable so I can paint it. So that's at least partially there. Does anybody see any problems with this? All right, well, we're done. You can all go home. So we have seams, right? We have this leg is divided into these 4 pieces, right? If you were imagining this as a piece of cloth you were sewing together, you'd have stitches along all of these lines. And when you're painting, if you imagine painting something in Photoshop over top of this, you're gonna have to worry about whether or not things match up across those seams. So this gives us 4 seams, I believe that's right, around the circumference of this leg that run vertically. That's probably more than we would like. We'd like to see things look as if they're a single piece and not as if they're a bunch of kind of patchy pieces put together. Does that make sense, or should we demo this seam thing? I'm immune to uncomfortable silences, so I'll just wait until someone lets me know.
I think it makes sense.
That's the kind of half-hearted response I'm looking for. All right, so we've got too many seams. So what do we do to fix that? Well, let's look at our other mapping options. So we know what automatic does is it kind of says, Maya, figure out what you're going to do. Give me a map. It's kind of the one-button solution. You can change some aspects of automatic mapping. If we go into, I'm just going to create UVs and then the options box for automatic mapping. Right, we can change the number of planes that Maya is using to make this stuff. We can try to optimize it for less distortion or fewer pieces. There's some other options down here. Honestly, for the most part, if you're using automatic mapping, it's just to get something you can work with. And most people I know don't mess with these settings too much because you're almost never going to run into the situation where you can change this, hit the button, and be done. You're always going to end up doing something else. So I'm not going to belabor these settings too awful much. Let's take a look at cylindrical mapping. So because legs, arms, tentacles, guns, all these things are basically cylinders, you get a lot of mileage out of cylindrical mapping for games, movies, characters in production. You can see that it makes this sort of cylindrical cage around the leg. And there are some handles that control some stuff. And if you move the handles, you'll see your UV map change. So this first handle at the top kind of changes the scale of the projection. And that's these little blue handles around the top of the cylinder. You can change the height of the cylinder with this yellow handle here. Turns green when it's not selected. So that's 2 adjustments. If we look at the middle row, we've got these 2 red handles, which determine the kind of sweep or coverage of the cylindrical map. So for most cylinders, they're mostly going to be complete, so legs, arms, tentacles, etc. You'll probably pull this all the way. You'll notice that it's not changing which polygons it's actually mapping, it's just changing their proportions on screen. This just gets you a bit closer to their actual relationships. If this leg weren't quite so straight up and down, and we needed to move the cylinder or rotate it in some way, we could do that by going to this little T icon. It's at the bottom. You'll see this as part of all of our UV projections. So if you click that red T, you'll see a manipulator handle come up, and you'll see that you can move the cylinder around. That does various things to your UV map. You can also rotate it. It kind of changes how those are projected. So it's a pretty common workflow to, say, pick an arm of a model, create a cylindrical projection, align it roughly to the same rotation or the same orientation as the arm, and then kind of go from there. In this example, the leg's pretty straight up and down, so you don't really need to move this projection around much. Okay, so this cylinder projection gives us somewhere to start. So typical UV workflow is that you'll select a bunch of faces, choose some projection method, get some UVs here, and then immediately move them out of the way. We only have this one object. It's going to have 3 different little sections we're going to map. But if you imagine a full character, right, you'd have arms and legs and torso and head, blah, blah, blah. You don't want them all to appear on top of each other as you're creating these UVs. It's easy to separate them, but it's even easier just to kind of move these out into this workspace. At the end of the day, they all have to end up here in the upper right. But while I'm working on them, they can be anywhere. Okay, so I'm going to move that kind of out of the upper quadrant. So this part of the map that corresponds to the kind of outside of the cylinder of the leg, so everything but this top and bottom, that part looks okay. It's not great, but it's not bad. The top and bottom, though, don't look very good, right? This is like super stretched out. I'm in face mode, which works. I can select even in the UV editor, so I'm just clicking a face here to kind of see where things are. So this business is pretty hard to read. So I think I need to map this in a different way. So to do that, I'm just going to select all these faces. Then I'm going to go to create UVs. And because this is basically a flat thing that I can project a plane onto if I wanted, I'm going to use planar mapping. And generally when you're using planar mapping, you're going to go into the options box because you need to decide which direction you're projecting from. So I'm going to create UVs, planar mapping, options box. And if I look down at my axis orientation in the lower left-hand corner, I can see I want to project a plane from the Y direction. So a plane basically from the ceiling or from the sky. That's from the Y axis. So I'll choose Y here. And I generally choose keep image width height ratio. This seems to keep the proportions of the individual polygons more natural, or in other words, less distorted relative to their actual size in 3 dimensions. So I'll go ahead and check that. And then I'm going to check project. So we'll see this planar projection manipulator pop up. These manipulators are similar to the ones that we used for the cylinders just a second ago, right? We can make this bigger. We can adjust it or rotate it as needed. For our purposes, though, a regular projection with no real adjustment is fine as long as it comes from the Y-axis. Okay, so I projected this. I'm going to move it out of the way. Then I'm going to repeat that process for the bottom surface here. Just going to select all these faces. Create UVs, planar mapping. I know this is set to Y because I just did it, so I'll just click the button and let it do its work. And there we have the bottom. I'll move that out of the way. This is starting to get a bit better, right? We don't have any weird kind of smushed triangles kind of trailing off or smeared across at the top. This is more human readable than it was a minute ago. However, because I've been doing this a little while, I know that we can improve this to get a bit less distortion. So just like if you're sewing something or creating a 3D object out of some sort of flat 2D material, you realize that there's no way to flatten out this in such a way that you get zero distortion. So UV mapping is in a lot of ways about managing distortion or making the distortion human readable. So when you looked at that face UV the other day, I'll pop up another one so you know what I'm talking about. I love how weird these images are. I'm kind of surprised I haven't seen this hung up in the gallery, by the way. This is the kind of thing that certain fine artists would probably love. So we're looking at this face UV map, right? It's distorted, but it's distorted in such a way that I can still read it, right? If I need to paint something, you told me to paint a beard on this person, right? I have a pretty good idea of where that beard needs to go, and I can paint on it. But clearly, there's still going to be some stretching between the thing I paint and when it gets wrapped around. It's just the nature of the beast. It's the difficulty of going from a 2D texture to a 3D object. So that said, I know that we can improve this map a bit. And to do that, we're going to use the relax and unfold tools. So we've got ourselves this UV projection. I'm going to switch to UV mode so I can manipulate them. So I'm just right-clicking, going to UV. I'll select this whole piece. In UV, this is called a shell. So right now we've got 3 shells. Then I'm going to click this tool with the like sideways blue T up here. The smooth U. It's not the smooth UV tool. Well, I guess it might be called that. I called it Unfold and Relax. When you click that, you should see Unfold and Relax pop up here at the bottom. So let's kind of see what these things do. The way this interface works is a little different than the other ones. So I'm going to left click and drag on Unfold. And we're going to see this thing kind of billow out and become a slightly different silhouette. So it's just left clicking and dragging on Unfold. If you left click and drag on Relax, it kind of crumples up again in a way that is not, if you ask me, entirely intuitive. In this example, it was enough to just run the Unfold operation. All I had to do was left click and drag on Unfold, and I get a UV map where there's less distortion. In a lot of cases, you need to do both Relax and Unfold, and that usually looks like relaxing a little bit, and then unfolding a little bit, and then relaxing a little bit, and then unfolding a little bit, and repeating until you get something that is both human readable and has less distortion. In previous versions of Maya, there were various ways to look at distortion. You could map a checkerboard texture or something on there to kind of look at it visually. In this version of Maya, there's actually a thing that calculates distortion. So if you look at the top, in the middle, there's two squares and one is red and blue. This is the Display UV Distortion tool. This tool is kind of neat. It's not really perfect because it doesn't seem to adequately account for the scales of the various projections. I think it's probably still in the works a bit. But in general, when you see red, that means something is smaller in the UV map than it is on the actual model. When you see blue, it's larger on the UV map than it is on the model. And when you see white, that means it's not distorted. So we'll see pretty quickly. I select these UVs and go to scale, that this thing is scale dependent. All right, so I can scale up and then we can see that distortion map kind of change. So smaller than the model, everything's close to not being distorted, bigger than the model, getting more distorted as we move up. The reason I don't really love this scale dependence is that these things are relative. We're going to end up scaling them back down to get them in this quadrant anyway. So it's going to look like they're going to become more distorted, when in fact they're not really becoming any more distorted, right? The relationships between the individual vertices here aren't changing, just the scale of the whole thing. But this is a way to check the mapping that I've done. So I can see here that by scaling up to here, that for the leg itself, I've got a map that doesn't have a whole lot of distortion. It has some around the knee, a bit more around the bottom. And if we scale these, we'll see the same thing. You can also use this distortion map to get these things to scale relative to each other, right? So now that I've scaled them down to the point where they're not particularly distorted, I know that the size of this triangle here on my UV map is appropriately relative to the size of this square. In other words, I'm not going to use a huge amount of my texture to cover this top and then a tiny amount to cover the whole leg. We don't want that. All right, so where's everybody at with this? Anybody having a tough time getting here? We're all kind of on the same page?
Yeah.
All right, thank you for the feedback, I appreciate it. Okay, so we've got a map, it's not bad. Let's get all of this into our upper right quadrant, and then from there it's very similar to the cube. We'll be making a UV snapshot, setting up a workspace, etc. if we're going to texture this leg. So I'll make sure I'm in UV mode. I'm going to select all of these things and just scale them down so that they're all kind of the same scale. Actually, this is a good place to demo this. So Maya has a pretty neat option where it will lay these things out in your upper right quadrant for you, which works pretty well sometimes at least. So if I just go to polygons and then click layout, yeah, you have to be in object mode. Let's try that again. Polygons, layout. We'll see it kind of move those into the upper quadrant for you, and I believe it will keep their sizes proportional to each other. So you could do that manually, right, by just kind of moving stuff in and scaling it, or you can go to polygons layout, which sometimes will give you a decent layout. It does make some weird choices though, right? If we imagine painting this in Photoshop, we've got a lot of space here that isn't doing anything, and then these things are bordering each other, so there's no real good reason for that. So I wouldn't grab that one. If you want to select a single UV shell, the easy way to do that is to just click on a single UV in that shell, and then we're going to use what's called the marking menu. So Control, right click, to shell. And that way, if things are really close together or even overlapping on the map, you can get to one of them without the other. So if I need to grab this shell, again, I'll just click one UV there, Control, right click, to shell. And I can move that around. So I like my maps a little bit more airy than Maya likes it, so I'll move that to there. And that's an okay UV map for this leg. So I'm going to go ahead and go to File, Save, just so I don't have to do this again if Maya crashes. If you click away from your object, if you're not selecting your object anymore, your UVs will disappear. This has led many a beginning Maya user to freak out, including myself when I was first learning the software, because I felt like if I didn't finish it all, then it would go away. That's not the case. As soon as you click on that object again, those UVs come back. Okay, so if we were just going to start painting on this, we could do the same thing we did to the cube, which would be, I'm going to turn off this distortion map because it's obnoxious. It would be to go to polygons, UV snapshot, save it out, open it in Photoshop, etc. That's fine. But what I'm going to do now is show you the 3D paint tool, which is a good way to kind of create landmarks in your for use in UV painting later. In theory, this would let you just paint stuff, paint textures onto objects. In practice, no one uses it for that. So what I'm going to do is with the object selected, go to Rendering, and then Texturing, 3D Paint Tool. I'm going to load the options box. It's going to throw an error up. It's going to say, some surfaces have no file texture assigned to the current attribute. That's saying that I would like to let you paint something, but I don't have a file to store that information in. That's okay, we can give it one. You'll also notice that if you hover over the object, it's giving you a big red X. You can't paint anything. So to use this tool, we've got to start at the bottom under File Textures. We're going to leave Attribute to Paint on Color because we're going to paint color. We need to create a file basically for Maya to write some paint information into. So we're going to go to Assign, Edit Textures. So if this were me and I were UVing this leg, I would want this paint file that we're about to create to be the same size as whatever texture I'm going to make. Let's use 512 just because. And then, because I organize things often by file type, I use PNGs for UV snapshots and for 3D paint on the occasions that I use it. Because they serve the same purpose. I'm just landmarking something so that I can use it as a guide. So I'm going to change that to PNG. And I'm going to click Assign Edit Textures. So let's look at where that texture actually goes, that file that we just created. If we take a look in our project folder, under Images, Source Images, 3D Paint Textures. Oh, it hasn't saved yet, so it's not there. There we go. Let's go ahead and click Save Textures, and then our file will actually pop up. So we'll see the scene name, and then a PNG. Right now it's blank, we haven't done anything. All we've done is create a texture for Maya to save some information in. But it's good to know where that thing lives. Okay, so back in Maya. Now if I hover over the leg, you'll see that I actually can paint on it. Just have a brush, I can paint stuff. Go ahead and undo that. All right, so let's talk about some brush settings. The easy way to adjust brush radius is to use the B key, so hold down B, and then left click and drag your mouse left or right. That will change your brush radius. This is a common shortcut. It happens in the Sculpt Geometry tool and various other tools in Maya. Soft Select works the same way. Hold down B, and then scrub to determine size. We have various types of brushes down here. Like I said, for the most part, people just use this for landmarking, so they tend to leave it on, the default brushes, but you could make a softer brush or even use a file for a brush if you wanted to try to paint something on there. Color does what it sounds like. So you can choose a color here. Since we're landmarking, I typically choose one of these default colors. They're pretty super saturated, bright, and garish. They're not typically colors that are used in texture painting for the most part, so you can use them to kind of guide where you're going. And then opacity, which changes the opacity of the painting you're doing. You can flood an entire surface if you use the flood section. Then you have various paint operations here. Of these, the ones that I think are useful are erase, and you can clone across seams. We'll get to that a bit later in our UV mapping, but remember that this is here. This will be useful later. Okay, so I've been talking about landmarking. What I actually mean by that is, let's pretend that we're doing a character and this is the leg, and I want some kind of feature on the leg. I want a knee pad, or I want a buckle, or I want a holster, or I want a scar. I want something on this leg, and I want to know where to paint that in. That's sort of apparent from this image, right? I happen to know that this seam runs along the back of the leg because I've done this a few times, but if you don't know that, by default, this can get a little confusing, right? Where's the knee actually at? Is it in the middle? It could be. But it's easier to just identify it specifically rather than guess. So let's say I wanted some sort of pocket or patch up here that I was going to paint into my texture. Maybe I want it on the thigh. I'd make my brush a bit smaller and just kind of, roughly paint in. That's sort of where I want that to live. Let's pretend. So I've done that. I'll go down here to Save Textures, and we'll see that pop up in the UV editor. I've actually created a file texture, and that color is being applied. You can choose to have the texture save automatically every time you stroke with the brush. That's pretty useful, I think, so I usually turn that on. We'll do the same thing at the bottom. There's going to be, I think, it's going to be James Bond, so I'm going to put a strap of the diving knife down here, so I'm just going to mark where I want that to be. Right? Clearly we're not painting for beauty here. We're just kind of identifying areas. And if we take a look at our preview, we can see that this information is basically just updating as we paint. So what's the point of that? Why is that useful? I will show you. Let's make ourselves a workspace for this leg. So I'm going to use a UV snapshot to export these. So go back to object mode. Make sure this leg is selected. Polygons, UV snapshot. Using 512. I'm going to put this in source images instead of images, so I clicked Browse beside the file name, and then navigate to source images. And I'll call this leg UV. I'll leave my color value at white and change this to PNG. When I click OK, we'll see that Maya saved a PNG file for me. So let's go look at that. I'm in source images, and there it is. So I'll open this with Photoshop. All right, who knows the next step?
Adding a background so we can see the image.
Absolutely, thank you, sir. All right, so I'm gonna make myself a solid color background. I'll use middle gray, let's say. And pull it below my UVs. Then I'll make the last layer, that's color. Okay, so we've got our UVs and we could paint on them, but now I want to bring in that file I painted a second ago to use that as kind of a guide for maybe cloning in my imaginary straps and pocket at this point. So let's open that file as well. It's in source images, 3D paint textures. There we go. Let's drag that. Because it's the same size, it can just live on top here. Drag it in and hit enter. And you can use this in a variety of ways. You can change its blending mode or opacity, right? I can put it under my color layer and then paint on top of it. That's typically the way I use it. Because I can change the opacity, I can use this as a guide if I want. You can put it on top and screen it or something if you want it instead. But now I have this information. So I know that, okay, I'm going to put my pocket roughly here. I would put my strap and my diving knife roughly here, and the rest of the leg I could texture as needed. So that's a pretty typical use of the 3D paint tool. Identifying areas and then bringing it in as a guide so that you can do more accurate texture painting. All right, questions about using the 3D paint tool to identify areas in your model? All right. So let's use an alternate route to get to this map. We use cylindrical projection because this is roughly a cylinder. There's more than one way to get there. Another typical UV workflow is to just get a map with like a planar projection, make a cut, and then relax unfold in a similar way to what we did. So let's do that. I'm I'll leave this stuff on there for now. Actually, it's probably gonna get weird. I'm gonna reopen the last version so I can deal without that 3D paint. Oh, that was stupid. All right, whatever, it's on there. Okay, so let's get a planar projection of this entire leg. So I'm gonna select the object, go to my polygon menu set, create UVs, and in this case I want a planar map from the side, so I'm gonna pop into the options box and choose X instead of Y. And I'll go ahead and hit project. If you want to get rid of this 3D paint, which is going to become increasingly annoying and smeary, I'm just going to assign a new texture to this, so I'll assign a new Lambert, and I'll get rid of it. Okay, so this is what our X planar projection looks like, right? We can clearly see the shape of the leg from the X-axis, so from here. So this would work fine to paint this side, but if we used this as a map, as things got near the edge here, they would smear across these faces. And then the back side would be exactly the same as this side, which we might not want. However, we can use this as a base and work on it. So I want to split this into 3 pieces. I'm going to cut off this set of faces, the bottom set of faces, then I'm going to make a cut along the back of the leg and let it relax. So let's do that stepwise. I'm going to go to edge. I'm just double clicking this top edge. Should select all the edges around there. Then in my UV texture editor window, I'll go to cut edges. That's this little scissors icon here. Or polygons, cut UV edges. Does the same thing. It's going to look like nothing happened. You'll see a result though that you got to cut. Now I want to take this has become a separate shell. I want to move it away from these other UVs. So to do that, I'm going to go into UV mode, excuse me. Select, and then I'll use my marking menu to UV shell. Once I have the shell selected, I can move it out of the way. So you could have done the same thing in the UV texture editor window. So I'm in UV mode. So I grabbed a UV, going to use my marking menu, control right click to shell. Oh, that's grabbing the whole leg. If you're doing it in the UV texture window, you'd kind of do it in reverse. You'd grab the leg and move it away from the other piece. So grab here, to shell, let's get it out of the way. So I can grab that and move it. The idea is just to get this piece away from the leg so that we can kind of deal with our UV separately. I'll do the same thing for the bottom. So I'm going to select this edge, go to cut UV edges. Control right click, let's see if going to, no, it doesn't work the way I'd hoped. So UV mode. To shell, move the shell out of the way. All right, so I've got the top and bottom separate. Those maps aren't really great, right? They're, in fact, not really maps to speak of. They're terrible, but we'll fix them momentarily. I want to deal with the main part of the leg here. So a large part of deciding how to UV objects is deciding where your seams go. There are always going to be seams, so you want to be able to put these in places that are ideally facing away from the camera so that you never see them. But if they have to face the camera, they're in places that aren't that interesting visually. So for character models, right, we've seen that you don't put seams in the middle of the face. The seams typically are here along the top or the crown of the head. That doesn't get a lot of attention from the camera usually. For things like objects, you put seams around the backside or on the bottom when you can. So a good general rule is I'm just going to put this on the back. So if this is a leg, my knee's up here in the front. I'm going to cut a seam right down the back. And then we're going to use relax unfold to kind of spread that apart. So to cut this seam, I'll go into edge mode. Select those edges. I will cut those UVs. It's going to look like nothing happened. Make sure that actually happened. All right. Now let's go into UV mode and use relax and unfold. So I'm going to go into the smooth UV tool, as they're calling it, and unfold this, and you should see it look pretty similar to the thing we got when we cylindrical mapped it. So it's just another way to get to the same place. It's another pretty common workflow is just get something to work with in the UV texture editor, make your cuts in a logical place, and then relax, unfold them so that you end up with a good map. The conceptual thing here, the thing that needs judgment is where those cuts are placed. And it's just kind of something that will come with time and also with your ability to kind of visualize the process here of taking something that's 3 dimensions and then flattening it out onto a surface. All right, if I were going to finish this out, I would just planar map these. Go to face mode. And then I would do the same scaling thing I'd done before, and that gets us to pretty much the same place. All right, questions about this so far? All right. So let's take a look at the pumpkin file. We're going to use many of the same techniques on that file. It's just something a little bit more complex. Let's go ahead and go to File, Open Scene, and open Pumpkin UV Demo. You can save this or not, as you wish. So we've got a pumpkin here. It doesn't look that great. But if you go into smooth mode, so if you select it and hit 3, it starts to look a little bit more pumpkin-like. So that's 1, oops, that's 3. Typically, you'll do UV mapping with your objects in 1 mode or an unsmoothed mode. And that's just because it's easier to see where the edges and lines are, right? If I go into 3, right, things get weird. These things turn into curves, and then it gets weird to kind of see where they actually live on the model. So we'll use that mode for texturing this, for UV mapping it. All right, so let's get a planar projection, cut some pieces off, make a seam, and then relax. Same way that we did the leg, right? It's just a slightly different shape. It's more bulby than the leg is. So select my object, make sure my UV texture editor window is up. This is the default mapping for a sphere in Maya. it will not work very well in this particular case. Once you've started adjusting stuff, it doesn't function that well. So let's create ourselves a planar map. And I'm going to use the x-axis again. It basically doesn't really matter at this point, but I like x because it's going to be a little bit more readable from the start, I think. So I'll click project, and you should see something that looks like just kind of a 2D projection of your pumpkin there. All right, anybody got suggestions for where I should put the first seam? What should I cut off first? Yeah, the stalk? Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to grab the edges around the base of this. Annoyingly, it's not going to let you double click and select that whole edge ring, even though it is an edge ring. So I have to do it manually. And then I will cut those UVs. Let's go into UV mode. Select here, Control right click, grab the shell, move it out of the way. All right, let's do the same thing to the bottom. So I'm just going to cut off this little thing here where the kind of segments of the pumpkin would meet. So I'll go to edge mode. Select those edges. Cut UVs. Go to UV mode. Come on. That's what it is, okay. Go to UV mode, Control right click to shell, move tool, move it out of the way. So we've cut off the top and bottom. Pumpkin's more or less radially symmetrical, where the main body is anyway. So where we put the seam right now would just depend on where we were planning on putting it in the scene. Typically you'd have a scene kind of built at this point. If not, then the decision is kind of arbitrary. I suspect whenever I frame this, if I were putting it in something, I'd want to be able to see that curve. So this is probably going to be the front. So let's move around here. And I'll kind of call this the back. I'm going to go to edge mode, select the edge that runs from the top to the bottom, and then cut it. So I've selected that edge, go to cut UVs. So this cut doesn't serve the purpose of separating out a piece. What this cut does is gives us a way to flatten this out. So if we imagine this was a beach ball or something that's made out of material, you were taking a pair of scissors to it and just cutting from the top to the bottom, and that would let you kind of flatten that out onto a surface. So the flattening we'll do with the Smooth UVs tool. So in the UV texture editor, I'll go into UV mode, select all of these, click Smooth, and then run and unfold. That doesn't really look that great. So here's where we go into the kind of sequence of unfold and relax. I don't really like where that's going, so I'm going to undo back here. I'll start relaxing from the front, and then unfold. Man, that's not really working that well either. This is one of those things that'll happen sometimes. So it's not that different from the leg if you think about it, right? We've got a kind of roundish thing that sort of has some bulges in it, but for whatever reason, the software is not really interested in letting me unfold this in a way that is particularly useful looking. The good news is that we have other kinds of projection we can use. What's up?
Was it matter when you make the cut?
Absolutely. It doesn't matter which of these vertical edges I picked, but if I were to, what's up?
If you cut it like horizontally, would it be different?
Yeah, you could cut it into two hemisphere pieces, and that might be easier to flatten out. So the trade-off is that gives you a seam in the middle of the pumpkin, right? Which would probably be visible from every angle. So in this case, the trade-off is you probably want to keep a seam vertical and ideally between one of these segments, so it's kind of hidden in a shadow maybe. But it's not really working with planar projection and relaxing. Well, that's okay because we can use spherical projection because this is roughly a sphere. So we've already split these two pieces off, which is good because we don't really want to spherically project those. We just want to get the main body of it. One cool thing about the UV texture editor window is that you can use it to select stuff, and you can almost use it like a mask in some ways, right? I can select all of these faces and none of these just by going into, just hitting Q to get my selection tool, right-clicking in the UV texture editor window, going into face mode, and selecting those faces. With those faces selected, I'll go to Create UVs, Spherical Mapping. And we'll see a big map pop up. Spherical mapping has many of the same controls as the other UV map tools that we've used. Right, I can sort of use this to scale. I can use the controls in the middle to change the kind of aspect ratio of the way the projection works. I could rotate it or scale it by using this T. Luckily what we have here is pretty close to a default sphere, so Maya pretty much placed this projection in a useful way. We can see how our projection choices will change the distortion if you turn on the distortion map while you still got the projection active. This can be a useful way to kind of make these adjustments, so rather than just kind of guessing where the distortion is going to be, you can make a choice. So it looks like what I have to trade off here is that I can get to a place where there's very little distortion along the center, which is nice, but then I'm going to have some distortion around the bottom and top. That's okay. I mean, it's a sphere and we're mapping it to a flat plane, so you're going to have distortion, right? Cartographers have been dealing with this problem since globes were invented. It's difficult to get a 2D thing onto a sphere. That's why there are like Mercator projections and I don't know, 10 other kinds of projections for flat maps, for maps of the world. All right, so looks like from adjusting, here seems to be pretty good. I've got very little distortion over the center, some at the top and bottom. Just have to kind of deal with that. So it's kind of got the middle done. Now let's go back and deal with the shaft, the top part, as well as the bottom. So for this, again, the leg is a good kind of conceptual touchstone, right? We've got something that's roughly cylindrical, happens to be bent a bit, but that's not particularly important. And then it has a kind of lid or top on it. So let's cut this top off, and then we'll unwrap this section down here and the top separately. So I'm going to go into edge mode. Just double click on one of these edges and I'll select this edge loop. Cut UVs. Go into UV mode. Make sure I'm choosing a UV that's on the cap. Control right click to shell. Move it out of the way. So I'm just going to kind of move my top and bottom over here. We'll get to those in a second. So now I have just the stalk. All right, same procedure here. I'm going to make a cut up this side of the stalk because that'll probably be behind off camera. And then I'm going to use my relax tools to get a map. So I'll go into edge mode. If you double click that edge, it'll select just two edges too many, one edge too many, so I'm just going to control click to get rid of that one, or you can manually select all of those, either one. Cut UVs, go back into UV mode, select that shell, go to the Smooth UV tool, and unfold it. So this would be a place where we use unfold and relax, kind of repeatedly, just relaxing a little, unfolding, relaxing, unfolding, until we get something that looks, not bad. This is, just kind of a technique that you figure out over time about how far to relax, then how far to unfold. You can always undo if you need to. All right, so let's grab this top shell. Let's see if we can just kind of unfold that. Looks like we can, so we don't even really need to reproject it. Right, that looks about right. It looks pretty much like I planar projected it from straight on. Let's do the same thing for this little bottom piece. Just grabbing the whole shell and unfolding it. All right, so that gives us 4 shells or 4 pieces. We've got the main body of the pumpkin. We've got the stalk. We've got the top of the stalk. And we've got this little bit on the bottom. So we need to get these all into our upper right quadrant. Let's get them sized correctly using our distortion map. So this already looks pretty good to me, so I'm just going to kind of size everything relative to that. So I'm grabbing the UVs for the stalk. I'll scale and see where they look the least distorted. So that looks pretty good. Same with the top piece. And the same with the bottom. All right, so now that everything is sort of scaled together, we can go to polygons, layout, be in object mode, polygons, layout, and it will move them all. It will change their colors, but it should keep their relative scales the same. You could also do that manually. All right, so at this point, I could use the 3D paint tool to sort of identify some features that I might like to paint manually. So I could use the 3D paint tool to identify, say, where the kind of folds in on the stalk of the pumpkin are, so that I could maybe, do a little bit of shadow accentuation, paint a little darker in there if I wanted. I could use that tool to identify this area here. There's often some kind of collected grime in this area I might paint in. Same thing with these divots or indentations. Right, this is human readable insofar as I understand this wraps, but it's not super obvious. I mean, I guess I can tell that these are the indentations here because they're closer together, right? But it's not so obvious that maybe doing a little bit of painting might not be useful. All right, so assuming I've done that already, I've identified the areas that I like with 3D Paint. Same set of steps. Object mode, select the object. UV snapshot. I'll put it in source images. Call it pumpkin UV. Let's do 1024. I'll keep it as a PNG and hit OK. Go into Photoshop and open that file. From here, I'll set up a background and then a color layer, and then I've got a workspace that I can use to paint that pumpkin. So let's do a solid color background. Once I've got my 3 layers set up, I can save this as Pumpkin Workspace. There's one already, so I'll call it Pumpkin Workspace 2 in case you guys want to reference the other one. I think the UV map's different on the other one, so it won't work to apply it to the pumpkin. Yeah.
So if you put a picture in Photoshop and paint over it, and you put it back in Maya, will it show up with the painting emergency line?
Yeah, like if I downloaded a texture and threw it in here on the layer. Yeah, so the workflow is that we use this as a workspace, and then when you're ready to save something out, so let's say I did some quick painting here. We'll do the world's most beautiful jack-o'-lantern. All right, so I've made some painting. I've decided this is perfect. I'm ready to save this out. I'm going to make the UV layer invisible. Go to File, Save As. And a pretty typical choice here is to use TIFFs. They're uncompressed. And I usually name it based on the channel that I'm painting, so pumpkin color in this case. And I'll get rid of layers because you don't need them. Go ahead and hit save. And then in Maya, you would add a new material, so this wouldn't be on Lambert 1, and then map the color to the color channel, which is something that we've done previously. And there it is. Okay, so we've talked about planar mapping, cylindrical mapping, spherical mapping, and automatic mapping. Create UVs based on camera is really just planar mapping with the camera as the origin plane. So this can sometimes be useful if you know you have a really good frame on something and you want to use that, although you really get to the same place by planar mapping from an axis and then just using the relax tool. In the UV texture editor window, we've talked about this distortion map, which is pretty useful. We've talked about cut or separate UVs. We've talked about using the smooth UV tool or relaxing and unfolding to get shells. Questions about this stuff? All right, cool. So I have obviously given you a pumpkin model here. I'd like to see for kind of the in-class part of Project 2 for you guys to model your own pumpkin. You can use this as a guide if you want, or you can model it in a completely different way. That's fine with me. You're also going to model at some point what's called, I think, called a turban squash, and UV map it. I'll probably do that maybe as a demo going forward, maybe after we cover NURBS on Wednesday. So I'm not too concerned about that right now. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Project 2, so you guys can start thinking about how you're going to work on that. And then we'll have work time for Project 2 and for continuing exercise 2. So let's take a look at the schedule. Click into Project 2. So this is a props project. I've mentioned this before, props are pretty important for defining character and telling stories in films and games. What they look like, what condition they're in, where they are, what style they're in, what historical period it seems like they came from, tell you a lot about the place you're in and the people that are in it. So for this project, you're going to choose a set of props, model them, texture them, place them in a scene, add lighting, and then render out a couple of images for print that show off these models. This is sort of like a still life, so I'd encourage you to look for references that will inform your lighting in that way. And you can do this naturalistically, you can do this in a studio lighting sense, you can kind of go in a lot of different directions with how you're going to actually present this scene. So I've got a list of 10 sets. You're going to choose one of these sets to model. You'll then collect a bunch of references. You'll create a character that owns these things. So this is probably one of the most important parts of this project, is creating a character that gives you an idea of what these props might look like. So this will inform your modeling choices in terms of the style of the thing, what year they look like they're from, etc., what condition they're in, and it'll inform your texturing and lighting choices as well. In terms of creating a character, what we're talking about are a couple of paragraphs. You know, I don't need sketches and a complete biography. You can write as much as you want. You can certainly sketch. I'm not going to tell you not to. But what we need here is the nature of the person that owns these things. And I've included some questions in the description that can help you out with that. You're going to find references. More references are good. This is a pretty constant thing in 3D. Everyone's using references to do props. It's typical to kind of feel like you know what a whatever looks like, but when you actually think about it, it turns out you don't. It's probably something you've had drilled into you in drawing and painting classes already, so I won't belabor that too much, but generally modeling something without a reference is asking to kind of waste your own time. So production, you'll of course create this in Maya. You're going to render 2 images with at least 9.5 by 15, and then we'll put those in the class folder. And I have posted them at the Facebook group here. Sarit usually makes a Facebook group for kind of ongoing critique. I don't think he's done that yet this semester, so I'm going to check with him and see if that's a thing. But for now, don't worry too much about that. Just like with Project 1, we'll revise, and then eventually you'll do 2 images side by side on a 22 by 17. So research and pre-production, these 2 steps are actually due on Wednesday, the 1st. So you're going to want to hit the ground running on that. And you can download the PDF of this by clicking here if you need it. Questions about Project 2? All right, awesome.